Mujer apache cayó, en una trampa, el ranchero que debía matarla terminó siendo su esposo. She was born into a world that demanded strength and resilience from the very first moments of life. Her family, like many in their tribe, had survived generations of hardship, learning to live in harmony with the land and to respect every living thing around them. From the moment she could walk, the young woman was taught not only the usual lessons of childhood, but also the ways of the Apache: how to hunt, how to track, how to ride a horse with grace, and how to read the subtle signs of the wilderness. Every lesson was essential, for survival in her world was never guaranteed. Her days began with the first light of dawn. While the air was still cool and the sun cast long, soft shadows across the desert, she would rise with her family. She carried out her morning routines quietly, learning the rhythm of life that had been passed down through generations. Her mother taught her how to prepare food using the resources of the land, how to make herbs and remedies from plants, and how to care for those around her. Her father, a skilled hunter and tracker, taught her the ways of the hunt. He showed her how to move silently through the brush, how to watch the movement of animals, and how to understand the signs that the land itself provided. She was a quick learner, and soon she was able to anticipate the movements of the deer, the rabbits, and the birds. She learned the patience required to wait for the perfect moment, and the courage needed to act decisively when the time came. The young woman was not only skilled, but also intelligent and observant. She noticed things that others might overlook: the subtle change in the wind that hinted at rain, the tracks in the sand that revealed who had passed through, the way the sun painted the horizon at different times of day. These small observations made her wise beyond her years. She also had a deep sense of community, understanding that every action she took affected those around her. She learned from the elders of her tribe, listening to their stories and absorbing the wisdom they shared. Their stories spoke of bravery, resilience, and the importance of protecting their way of life. They told of ancestors who had survived hardships and enemies, and these stories inspired her to be strong and resourceful. Despite the strength of her upbringing, the world outside her tribe was changing rapidly. Settlers and ranchers were moving into lands that had long been Apache territory. The young woman and her people watched as their forests and plains were taken for grazing and farming. She had grown up hearing tales of conflict, and she knew that tensions between her people and the newcomers were rising. She saw the fear in her family's eyes and understood the quiet worry that ran through the community. Yet, even in the face of this danger, she remained proud and unyielding. She carried herself with dignity, confident in her skills and in the strength of her heritage. Her daily life involved not only survival skills, but also moments of joy and learning. She would ride through the open plains on her horse, feeling the wind rush past her as she explored the land she loved. She enjoyed games and challenges with the other children of her tribe, testing her strength and agility. She loved the stories told around the fire at night, stories that made her laugh, cry, and dream of the future. She learned the songs of her people, the dances that connected them to the earth, and the traditions that kept their culture alive. These experiences gave her a deep sense of identity and purpose, grounding her even as the outside world threatened to disrupt everything she knew. Her personality was a blend of courage, curiosity, and compassion. She would often help the younger children learn the ways of the tribe, guiding them patiently through the lessons that were so important for survival. She was not boastful of her skills, but her abilities in hunting, tracking, and riding were respected by all. People admired her calmness under pressure, the way she could make decisions quickly and wisely, and the way she treated everyone with respect. Her reputation grew, and even those who were not part of her tribe could see that she was special, a young woman whose presence commanded attention and respect without the need for words. However, she was also aware of the dangers that came with her world. The expansion of settlers brought not only fear and uncertainty, but also direct threats to her people's way of life. She knew that her skills might one day be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. She had heard stories of other tribes facing attacks, of families being forced from their homes, and of young women caught in situations beyond their control. These tales weighed heavily on her mind, but they also strengthened her resolve. She understood that being vigilant, skilled, and clever was not just a matter of pride, it was a matter of survival. One day, as she moved through the plains near her home, she noticed subtle changes in the environment. The tracks of horses that were not familiar to her, the sound of distant voices carried by the wind, and the glint of sunlight reflecting off metal objects all suggested that someone was nearby. She did not panic. Instead, she focused her senses, observing and analyzing every detail. She knew that she might be walking into a situation that could test her in ways she had never faced before, but even in the face of uncertainty, she felt confident. She trusted in her abilities, in the lessons she had learned from her parents, and in the strength she carried within herself. This confidence was paired with a deep connection to her culture and traditions. She understood that every choice she made had meaning and consequences. She respected the teachings of her elders and sought guidance from the stories that had been passed down through generations. She knew that her actions could honor or dishonor her people, and she carried that responsibility with grace. Even in moments of play or rest, she reflected on her role in her community and on the importance of maintaining the balance between survival, wisdom, and compassion. As the sun set over the plains, casting a golden glow across the land, she often paused to appreciate the beauty around her. The mountains in the distance, the rivers winding through the valleys, and the sky painted in shades of orange and pink reminded her of the world she loved and the life she was determined to protect. She felt a sense of purpose and belonging, knowing that she was part of something larger than herself. Her spirit was strong, her mind sharp, and her heart full of courage. She was ready for whatever challenges the world might place in her path, even if she could not yet imagine them. In these early years, the young woman's life was a mixture of learning, adventure, and preparation. Every day was a lesson, every challenge an opportunity to grow, and every moment a chance to honor the traditions of her people. She moved through the world with awareness, strength, and grace, ready to face the trials that lay ahead. Little did she know that her skills, her intelligence, and her courage would soon be tested in ways that would change her life forever, leading her to an encounter that would defy all expectations and alter the course of her destiny. Her story, though rooted in the hardships of her time, was also a story of hope, resilience, and the power of the human spirit. It was a story of a young woman who embraced her identity, cherished her people, and faced the world with bravery and determination. In the heart of the Apache lands, she stood as a symbol of strength, ready to navigate a world filled with challenges, uncertainty, and the promise of unexpected encounters that could change everything. Life in the Apache lands was never simple, and the young woman quickly realized that even the most cautious steps could lead to danger. The peace of her daily routines was fragile, and the presence of outsiders in their lands was becoming more frequent. Settlers, ranchers, and soldiers moved closer to the territory her people had called home for generations. Every day, the boundaries between the Apache lands and the encroaching settlements seemed to blur a little more. She knew from the stories of elders and from her own observations that these changes brought risk, tension, and the potential for conflict. One morning, while she was scouting the nearby hills for signs of game, she noticed something unusual. The tracks in the soft earth were not like any she had seen before. They were fresh, and the hoofprints belonged to horses that did not belong to her people. Her senses, sharpened by years of learning from her father, went immediately on alert. She crouched behind a rock and studied the landscape carefully. Her heart beat steadily, not with fear, but with the awareness that she might be facing a challenge that required all her skill. Every instinct she had honed over years of training told her to be cautious. For hours, she observed the movements of the strangers. They were well-armed and methodical, moving through the plains as though they were searching for something or someone. She realized with a sinking feeling that she herself might be the target. Stories of young women and brave warriors being captured or harmed were not just tales. They were real dangers, and she understood that she could not afford a mistake. The desert, which had always been her playground and her school, now felt like a place filled with unseen threats. She retreated carefully toward her village, leaving subtle signs that she had passed through. She knew her people would recognize the warning, and she hoped that her presence would alert her family and neighbors to the approaching danger. When she arrived, she shared her observations with the elders and her parents. Their faces grew serious as they listened, the lines of worry deepening. They had long feared the growing presence of outsiders, and now the young woman's keen eyes had confirmed their concerns. They discussed the best course of action, balancing the need for caution with the knowledge that retreating too far would also carry risks. Despite the tension, the young woman maintained her composure. Her training and her upbringing had prepared her for moments like this. She spent the rest of the day reinforcing her understanding of the terrain, noting the paths, the hiding spots, and the escape routes that could help her if she was ever forced to flee. She practiced her skills quietly, moving through the brush with the stealth of a seasoned tracker. She reminded herself that preparation and awareness were the keys to survival, and that panic would only make her vulnerable. As the days passed, the presence of the outsiders became clearer. She observed small camps being set up along the edges of the land, the distant glint of metal from tools and weapons, and the occasional sound of voices carried by the wind. It was obvious that these strangers were organized and had a purpose. The young woman felt a mix of anger and caution. She was determined to protect herself and her people, but she also knew that direct confrontation could be dangerous. Every decision required careful thought, weighing risk against opportunity. One afternoon, while moving along a ridge, she saw them again, this time closer than before. The group consisted of several men, and one of them stood out. He seemed observant, calculating, and confident in his movements. She recognized that he was likely in charge, leading the others with purpose. Her intuition, sharpened by years of training, told her that this man could be dangerous. She considered her options carefully. Retreating to safety was always an option, but she also knew that evasion alone might not be enough if they were determined to find her. The following day, events escalated. The strangers had set a trap, carefully choosing a location where the terrain would limit her movement and give them an advantage. They had thought ahead, assuming that anyone as skilled as her would recognize the obvious signs of danger, but they underestimated her intelligence and adaptability. She approached the area cautiously, her eyes scanning every detail, her mind calculating the risks. She could see the faint disturbances in the sand and the subtle arrangement of objects that indicated a snare had been set. Realizing the trap, she took a step back and considered her next move. Every instinct told her that this could be a turning point, a moment where one wrong step could lead to capture. Yet, even in this precarious situation, she did not panic. She remembered the lessons her parents had taught her: stay calm, think carefully, and use the knowledge of the land to your advantage. She evaluated the trap, looking for weaknesses, and formulated a plan to avoid being ensnared. Despite her caution, the outsiders had anticipated her intelligence and skill. She had to rely not only on her physical abilities, but also on her cleverness and quick thinking. As she moved through the area, she used natural cover, timing her steps to avoid detection. She observed the strangers' patterns, noting their focus and the points where their attention lapsed. Each movement she made was deliberate, each decision calculated to maximize her chance of escaping unharmed. Then, unexpectedly, she was confronted by the man in charge. He had managed to position himself where she could not see him until it was almost too late. For a brief moment, the situation was tense and dangerous. His eyes met hers, and she could sense both determination and curiosity in his gaze. He raised his hand, signaling the others to hold back. There was a quiet moment of understanding, or perhaps assessment between them. The young woman's heart beat steadily. She knew that every second counted and that her choices in this moment could define her future. Instead of attacking immediately, the man observed her, studying her movements, her posture, and the way she held herself. It was clear that he recognized her skill and intelligence, perhaps even admiring it silently. The other men waited, unsure of what to do, while he seemed to weigh his options carefully. This hesitation gave her a brief opportunity to think, to assess the situation, and to plan her next steps. She realized that survival might require not just speed and strength, but also the ability to read and respond to the intentions of others. Over the next hours, a subtle game of strategy unfolded. The young woman moved with care, avoiding traps and using the terrain to her advantage. The man followed, cautiously but deliberately, testing her reactions and observing her skill. Neither made a rash move, and neither fully revealed their intentions. It was a tense dance, a test of wits and endurance. Through it all, the young woman's mind remained sharp, her instincts finely tuned to the challenges before her. By the end of the day, the immediate danger had passed, but the tension lingered. She had avoided capture, using every lesson she had learned from her family and her people. Yet, she knew that this encounter was only the beginning. The outsiders were persistent, and the man in charge had clearly recognized her abilities. She also sensed, perhaps surprisingly, a hint of something else in his behavior, a complexity beyond the role of hunter or enemy. She did not fully understand it, but she noted it carefully, aware that the future might bring encounters that were not simply about survival or escape. Returning to her village that evening, she shared her experiences with her family and the elders. They listened with concern and admiration, recognizing the skill, bravery, and intelligence she had displayed. They knew that the challenges facing their people were growing, and that this encounter was a warning of the dangers to come. Yet they also understood that the young woman's courage and resourcefulness were a source of hope, demonstrating that strength, wisdom, and courage could prevail even in difficult circumstances. In the days that followed, she continued to observe, learn, and prepare. She remained vigilant, aware that the outsiders were still nearby, and that their interest in her had not waned. She refined her skills, strengthened her knowledge of the land, and remained ready for any encounter. At the same time, she reflected on the unusual behavior of the man in charge, sensing that there might be more to him than a simple enemy. It was a mystery she could not yet solve, but it added another layer of complexity to the challenges she faced. Through all of this, the young woman demonstrated not only survival skills, but also resilience of character. She faced danger with courage, approached challenges with intelligence, and maintained her sense of identity and purpose even under threat. She remained deeply connected to her people, aware that her actions affected not only herself, but also the community she loved. Her story, even at this stage, was one of determination, bravery, and the beginning of an extraordinary journey that would test her in ways she could not yet imagine. The tension between the young Apache woman and the man in charge of the outsiders had not faded. Even after her successful evasion of their initial trap, she could feel his presence in the land around her. It was as if he was always watching, analyzing, waiting. She had faced many dangers in her life, but this was different. This man, who should have been her enemy, seemed to be studying her in a way that went beyond the simple goal of capture. She did not fully understand his intentions, but she knew that she needed to remain cautious. Every step she took, every movement she made was observed. And yet, there was something in his actions that suggested hesitation, a pause that she had not expected from someone on a mission. The young woman considered her position carefully. She had always been taught to trust her instincts, to pay attention to the subtle signs of danger and opportunity. She noticed the way he moved, the way his eyes lingered when he thought no one was watching, and the small gestures that revealed more about him than words ever could. He was skilled, methodical, and confident, but there was a complexity to his behavior. He seemed to be weighing something inside himself, as though his mission was no longer the only thing guiding his actions. This realization puzzled her, and for the first time, she found herself wondering what could drive a man who should be her enemy to act in such a way. Over the next few days, the encounters continued, but they were no longer simple chases or attempts at capture. The man began to test her, but in ways that were different from before. He left subtle hints and opportunities for her to demonstrate her skill, as if he wanted to see how she would respond under pressure. She noticed that he avoided unnecessary violence, even when it would have been easy to overpower her. Instead, he seemed to be studying her courage, her intelligence, and the way she interacted with the land. At first, she remained skeptical. She had learned not to trust outsiders, and she reminded herself constantly that her safety depended on vigilance. Despite her caution, curiosity began to creep in. She could not ignore the fact that this man, who should have been a threat, displayed moments of restraint and observation that suggested something deeper. She began to notice patterns in his behavior, small details that indicated he was learning from her, adapting to her strategies, and perhaps even respecting her skills. The realization was both unsettling and intriguing. She had spent her life preparing to defend herself and her people, but now she faced a challenge of a different kind, understanding the intentions of someone who was supposed to be her enemy. One afternoon, as she moved quietly through a narrow canyon, she saw him waiting ahead. But instead of preparing for an attack, he simply watched. There was no malice in his expression, no rush to strike. It was as though he had paused, choosing to observe rather than act. She hesitated, unsure of what he intended. For the first time, she saw a human side to someone she had been trained to see only as an adversary. In that moment, she realized that understanding him might be as important as avoiding danger. Every decision she made had to consider not only survival, but also the emerging complexity of their interactions. The man began to communicate with her, though not with words at first. He left signals and small signs that could only be interpreted by someone who understood the land. He demonstrated his awareness of her abilities without endangering her directly. She recognized the subtlety of these gestures and responded with equal care, showing him that she understood both the risks and the intelligence behind his actions. In this exchange, a quiet connection began to form, built not on friendship or alliance, but on mutual respect and recognition of skill. Over time, these encounters grew more frequent, and a delicate rhythm developed between them. The young woman began to anticipate his movements, and he seemed to anticipate hers. They moved through the land in a way that required both courage and patience. There were moments of tension, certainly, but also moments of silent understanding. She realized that the man was no longer simply a hunter pursuing his mission. He was observing, learning, and perhaps even questioning his own objectives. His presence became a constant puzzle, a challenge that required not only physical skill, but also mental and emotional awareness. As the days passed, the young woman found herself reflecting on the man's behavior in ways she had not expected. She could see that he was struggling with a choice, and she began to wonder what experiences in his life had shaped him. Had he always been bound by orders and duty, or had he once been free to make his own decisions? These thoughts intrigued her, even as she remained vigilant. She knew that she could not afford to be careless, yet she also recognized that understanding him might provide insights that could protect her and her people. One evening, as the sun set and painted the canyon walls in shades of orange and gold, the young woman and the man found themselves in close proximity once more. There was no confrontation, no attack, only a quiet standoff, a recognition of each other's presence. In that moment, she noticed something remarkable, a hint of admiration in his gaze, tempered by caution. He did not speak, yet his actions communicated a respect for her courage and intelligence. She, in turn, felt a sense of curiosity and perhaps even empathy. She had learned to recognize the strength and spirit in others, and she sensed that beneath his role as an adversary lay a person capable of change. This realization marked a turning point. The young woman began to see that her interactions with the man were no longer simply about survival. They were about understanding, strategy, and the subtle dynamics of human behavior. She continued to move carefully, maintaining her vigilance, but she also began to experiment with subtle communication. Through gestures, signs, and careful observation, she tested whether he was willing to act with restraint and fairness. To her surprise, he often did. His hesitation, his careful assessment of her actions, and his refusal to act with unnecessary aggression all suggested that he was reconsidering his mission, or at least the way he approached it. The young woman's skill and intelligence were now matched by her growing insight into the man's character. She recognized that survival was no longer only about avoiding danger. It was about navigating the emerging complexities of human interaction. She began to anticipate not only the physical threats he posed, but also the psychological and emotional dynamics at play. Every encounter became a delicate dance, a test of courage, intelligence, and awareness. She realized that this challenge required not only her traditional skills, but also her ability to think creatively, adapt, and respond to nuance. In the following weeks, the encounters between the young woman and the man became a strange and delicate routine. They avoided direct confrontation, yet each meeting carried a sense of tension, curiosity, and unspoken communication. She observed that he no longer viewed her solely as a target but as a worthy opponent, someone whose courage and skill commanded respect. In turn, she found herself analyzing not only his intentions, but also his character, trying to understand the man behind the mission. Each day brought new insights, new strategies, and a growing awareness that this relationship, born from conflict, was evolving into something far more complex. Through it all, the young woman never let her guard down completely. She knew that danger was never far away, and that the man's hesitation might be temporary or deceptive. Yet, she also recognized that their interactions had opened the door to possibilities she had never imagined. The tension between them, the silent understanding, and the recognition of skill and courage created a dynamic that was both challenging and compelling. She began to see that survival, respect, and human connection could coexist in ways she had not anticipated. By the end of this period, the young woman had gained not only confidence in her own abilities, but also a new understanding of human complexity. She realized that strength was not only measured in physical skill, but also in the ability to read, interpret, and respond to the intentions of others. The man, who had begun as a threat, was becoming a puzzle, a challenge, and perhaps even a potential ally in ways that defied the simple roles of enemy and prey. She knew that the days ahead would be filled with both danger and discovery, and she felt ready to face whatever came next. Her story at this stage was one of courage, intelligence, and the beginnings of an extraordinary connection. The young woman had navigated a world filled with danger, survived a carefully laid trap, and begun to understand that human interactions were often as complex and unpredictable as the wilderness itself. She remained vigilant, prepared, and deeply connected to her people, yet she also faced a new challenge: understanding and responding to a man whose intentions were no longer simple, whose actions suggested a depth of character she had not anticipated, and whose presence would soon change her life in ways she could not yet imagine. After weeks of cautious encounters, the young Apache woman and the man in charge of the outsiders began to develop an unusual rhythm. What had started as a hunt, a game of cat and mouse, was slowly evolving into something more complex. Each meeting was now layered with unspoken understanding. The young woman remained vigilant, aware of the dangers surrounding them, yet she could sense a subtle shift in the man's behavior. He no longer approached with the singular intent of capture or harm. Instead, he seemed to be assessing, observing, and, in a way, learning from her. Their encounters became an exchange of skills. She taught herself to anticipate his moves, not just as threats but as patterns to understand, almost as if he were part of the landscape itself. She noted his strategies, the way he analyzed her actions, and the subtle hesitations that suggested he was reconsidering his mission. Likewise, he began to recognize her intelligence and resilience. Each day, he seemed less like an enemy and more like someone who, though bound by duty, could appreciate her courage and cleverness. There was a mutual respect forming silently, growing with every cautious interaction. The young woman began experimenting with subtle signals, testing whether he could adapt to her strategies and respond without aggression. She left small signs in the sand, moved through the brush in calculated ways, and observed how he reacted. Each time he demonstrated restraint, proving that he was learning from her and, in a way, trying to communicate through actions rather than words. She realized that their encounters had become a form of dialogue, a conversation conducted without speech, where every movement carried meaning and every decision reflected intelligence and intent. One day, while navigating a narrow canyon, the young woman found herself in a difficult position. She had been tracking game for her family when she noticed the man following her from a distance. This time, there was no immediate threat in his approach. Instead, he maintained a careful distance, observing her movements and mimicking some of the patterns she had used in previous encounters. She felt a mix of caution and curiosity. It was clear he wanted to see how she would respond, but there was no malice in his actions. The young woman realized that he was testing not just her skills but also the possibility of trust between them. As days turned into weeks, their interactions became more cooperative, though still subtle and cautious. She began to notice moments where he seemed willing to protect her, stepping in quietly when danger arose or guiding her away from hazards without her asking. At first, she was hesitant to trust these actions, unsure if they were genuine or simply another layer of strategy. However, over time, she began to see that his behavior was consistent, thoughtful, and increasingly protective. This realization gave her a new perspective on him. The man who had once been a threat was now showing signs of compassion, intelligence, and respect. The young woman also began to reflect on herself and her own responses. She noticed that she was not only surviving the encounters but also learning from them. The man's behavior challenged her assumptions about outsiders and forced her to see beyond the roles of enemy and ally. She realized that people could change, that intentions could be more complex than they appeared, and that trust, once earned, could open doors to unexpected possibilities. She was cautious, of course, but she also allowed herself to consider that a partnership, even a fragile one, might be possible. Over time, a silent understanding developed between them. They began to move through the land in ways that complemented each other. The young woman demonstrated her knowledge of the terrain, teaching him, without words, how to navigate safely and efficiently. In turn, he offered subtle guidance, showing her how to anticipate dangers she might not yet have noticed. Each interaction strengthened a bond of mutual respect. They were no longer simply hunter and hunted. They were two skilled individuals learning to understand and support each other, even in a world that was hostile and uncertain. One afternoon, a real challenge tested this fragile alliance. A sudden storm swept across the plains, turning dry paths into muddy torrents and creating dangerous conditions for anyone moving through the land. The young woman, who had always relied on her knowledge of the terrain, quickly assessed the situation and found a safe route to higher ground. To her surprise, the man followed her lead, acknowledging her judgment without a word. Together, they navigated the storm, using skill, awareness, and caution to reach safety. This shared experience strengthened their connection, demonstrating that cooperation could lead to survival in ways that individual effort alone could not achieve. During moments like these, the young woman began to notice subtle signs of humanity in the man. He showed patience when she taught him to track or avoid danger. He demonstrated careful observation and thoughtfulness, considering the consequences of his actions rather than acting impulsively. She began to sense that he was learning from her, adapting not just to her skills but to her perspective on the world. In turn, she found herself learning from him, not in ways that threatened her autonomy or safety, but in understanding how someone from a very different background approached challenges and decision-making. This growing understanding led to moments of quiet trust. They would move through the land together, sometimes for hours, without speaking a word, yet each aware of the other's intentions and movements. The young woman realized that trust could be established not only through words, but also through observation, consistency, and shared experience. She began to see that her initial judgment of him as an enemy was incomplete. He was more than his mission, and she had the ability to influence and understand his choices. As the seasons began to change, so did the depth of their connection. The young woman noticed that she no longer felt only cautious and defensive in his presence. Instead, there were moments of curiosity, reflection, and even subtle admiration for his ability to adapt and learn. She recognized that he was not just a man following orders. He was someone capable of thought, restraint, and insight. In turn, she noticed that he regarded her with a sense of respect and perhaps even fascination. He seemed to appreciate not only her skill and intelligence, but also her courage, her independence, and her unwavering connection to her people and her land. Their collaboration became more deliberate over time. The young woman would take the lead in navigating tricky terrain, teaching him to read signs in the land and anticipate challenges. He, in turn, provided guidance in ways that complemented her strategies, showing her how to anticipate human threats and respond with both caution and efficiency. Each day brought new opportunities to learn from one another, deepening the connection that had begun in suspicion and tension, but was now evolving into mutual respect and partnership. Despite the growing bond, the young woman never let her guard down completely. She remained aware of the dangers inherent in their world and the complexities of trust. Yet, she also recognized that the alliance they were forming had practical benefits, allowing both of them to navigate challenges more safely and effectively. She began to see that cooperation could transform a situation of potential conflict into one of shared survival, insight, and understanding. By the end of this period, the young woman and the man had developed a unique, fragile partnership. They were no longer strictly hunter and hunted. They had become allies in a world filled with danger, learning to rely on each other's skills, judgment, and insight. The young woman recognized that this bond was rare, built on courage, intelligence, and shared experience. She understood that the future would still hold challenges, but she now had a sense of the possibilities that could arise when trust, respect, and cooperation replaced suspicion and hostility. Her story, at this point, was no longer solely about survival. It was about the beginnings of connection, understanding, and partnership. The young woman had navigated danger, outsmarted traps, and remained true to her people and her culture. Now, she was learning that strength also lay in recognizing the humanity in others, even in those who had once been enemies. This realization set the stage for the next phase of her journey, where the bond they had formed would grow stronger, transforming an unlikely alliance into something more enduring, meaningful, and life-changing. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the bond between the young Apache woman and the man who had once been her pursuer grew stronger. What had begun as a tense game of survival had evolved into a complex relationship built on trust, understanding, and mutual respect. Both of them had learned from each other. She had gained insight into human behavior beyond her own tribe, and he had learned lessons about courage, resilience, and the wisdom of the land from her. Yet, despite the growing connection, both remained aware of the dangers that surrounded them, and neither took the other's presence lightly. One day, a new challenge arose that would test the strength of their partnership in a way neither could have predicted. A group of outsiders, unaware of the subtle alliance forming between the two, moved into the Apache lands with hostile intentions. They were well-armed and confident, seeking to assert control over the territory. The young woman and the man quickly realized that they would need to work together, combining their skills, knowledge, and instincts to protect themselves and maintain safety in the area. Their prior experiences had prepared them for this moment, but the danger was greater than anything they had faced before. The young woman took the lead, guiding them through familiar terrain while the man followed, providing protection and support. They moved silently and strategically, using every technique they had developed in previous encounters. Her knowledge of the land allowed them to anticipate the movements of the outsiders, while his strength and tactical thinking provided an added layer of security. They communicated through subtle gestures, signals, and glances, a language they had created together over weeks of cautious interaction. It was a true test of their collaboration, requiring not only skill but also trust. As they navigated the situation, moments of quiet admiration and respect emerged between them. The man observed the young woman's courage and intelligence, seeing how she remained calm under pressure and made decisions with clarity and precision. In turn, she noticed his thoughtfulness, restraint, and willingness to protect her rather than dominate the situation. It was clear to both of them that they had moved beyond the simple roles of hunter and hunted. They had become partners in the truest sense, relying on each other's abilities to survive and succeed. Through careful planning and execution, they managed to outmaneuver the group of outsiders, avoiding direct confrontation while ensuring safety for themselves. The young woman's strategies, combined with the man's strength and awareness, allowed them to navigate the land effectively, demonstrating the power of collaboration and mutual respect. After the threat had passed, they paused together in a quiet spot, catching their breath and reflecting on the journey they had shared. The tension between them had shifted. What was once fear and caution had grown into admiration, understanding, and a sense of connection. It was during these moments of calm that they began to speak more openly. The man shared stories of his life, of the choices that had brought him to this mission, and of the doubts and questions he had experienced along the way. He revealed the conflict within him, the tension between duty and conscience, and the recognition of the young woman's strength that had challenged his assumptions. She, in turn, shared stories of her people, her upbringing, and the lessons that had shaped her courage and resilience. These conversations, though limited and careful, deepened their bond and allowed them to see each other not just as individuals, but as humans with hopes, fears, and dreams. Over time, the young woman began to feel a sense of comfort and safety in his presence. She realized that the man she had once feared had become someone she could rely on, someone who understood her in ways that few others could. His respect for her abilities and his willingness to protect her created a foundation of trust that was both rare and powerful. She found herself thinking about him not as an outsider or a threat, but as a companion, someone who had shared her challenges and had proven his loyalty through action rather than words. The man, too, experienced a transformation. The mission that had brought him into Apache lands no longer defined his purpose. Instead, he found himself guided by admiration, respect, and eventually affection for the young woman. He saw her courage, her wisdom, and her unwavering commitment to her people, and he recognized qualities in her that he had never encountered before. His decisions became less about orders and more about protecting and supporting her. Over time, he understood that his presence in her life could no longer be measured by duty alone, but by the bond they had forged through shared experiences and mutual respect. As they spent more time together, the boundaries between caution and connection began to blur. The young woman noticed small gestures of care from him, the way he anticipated her needs, the moments when he ensured her safety without drawing attention to himself. She, in turn, responded with trust and collaboration, showing him the importance of patience, observation, and respect for the land. Their relationship had evolved into a partnership where both contributed equally, where strength was measured not just by skill but by understanding, and where loyalty and trust were more powerful than fear or obligation. One evening, as the sun set over the desert plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they found themselves resting together near a quiet river. The events of the day had tested their skills, their patience, and their partnership. They sat side by side, watching the water flow, feeling a sense of accomplishment and connection. In that moment, the young woman realized that the man who had once been her pursuer was no longer defined by the mission that had brought him into her life. He had become someone she could trust, someone who had chosen to protect rather than harm, and someone whose presence had transformed her understanding of courage, partnership, and humanity. It was a turning point. The young woman began to see the possibilities of a future where trust, respect, and even love could exist between two people from very different worlds. The man, too, recognized that his feelings had changed, that the bond they had forged could not be ignored or dismissed. Their shared experiences had created a foundation that went beyond survival, beyond duty, and into the realm of human connection and affection. They understood each other in ways that transcended words, guided by shared experience, mutual respect, and an appreciation for the strengths and values each brought to the relationship. Eventually, the young woman and the man made a decision that would forever change the course of their lives. They chose to remain together, not out of obligation or necessity, but out of mutual admiration, trust, and love. Their union was a testament to the power of understanding, resilience, and the human capacity for change. What had begun as a trap, a confrontation filled with danger and uncertainty, had transformed into a partnership that defied expectations, bridged cultural divides, and created a new path forward for both of them. In the years that followed, their story became known among their communities. It was a story of courage, resilience, and the unexpected ways that life could bring people together. They were respected not only for their skills and survival, but for the bond they had formed, a bond built on trust, respect, and the recognition of each other's humanity. The young woman, who had once faced danger alone, now had a partner who shared her journey, celebrated her strengths, and supported her in ways she had never imagined. Their story served as a reminder that even in the most challenging circumstances, the human heart could find connection, trust, and love. It showed that courage, intelligence, and integrity could create bonds that transcended fear, duty, and conflict. The young woman and the man, once adversaries, had discovered that the greatest victories were not always fought with weapons or skill, but with patience, understanding, and the willingness to see the good in another person. Through it all, they remained true to themselves and their values. The young woman continued to honor her heritage, her people, and the lessons of courage and resilience that had shaped her. The man, once an outsider, embraced the wisdom, strength, and compassion he had learned from her, allowing these lessons to guide his actions and decisions. Together, they navigated the challenges of life in a changing world, proving that even the most unlikely encounters could lead to enduring partnership and love. In the end, the young woman and the man had not only survived the dangers that had brought them together, they had thrived. They had built a life based on trust, understanding, and mutual respect, transforming a story of conflict into one of hope and connection. The young woman, who had once faced the threat of capture and harm, had found not only survival but a companion, an ally, and a partner for life. And the man, who had begun his journey as a pursuer, had discovered that the greatest purpose he could fulfill was not simply following orders, but standing beside someone he admired, respected, and loved. Their story became a legend, told and retold as a reminder of courage, trust, and the unexpected ways that life could bring people together. It was a story of survival, growth, and the human heart, demonstrating that even in the harshest circumstances, bonds could form that transcended fear, duty, and expectation. The young Apache woman and the man who had once been her pursuer had discovered that the most extraordinary journeys were often those that led to connection, understanding, and love.